Hey, good morning, team, and good morning, Dave. Thanks for meeting again for another exciting continuation to our governance policy and guidelines governance discussions that we're going through. Today, team, I'll remind you that, as we always mention, the world is changing and it's changing fast. Because of this, there's going to be gaps created and there's going to be winners and losers. So we want to make sure that we're on that winning side, and we hope to collaborate with you because we have the cure here. We have some solutions, and we can show you that direction. Hey, I'll remind everyone before Dave begins that this is really the seventh of our seminars. We've gone through some core questions and talked through provisioning. We've talked about really what are the enterprise decisions that are needed to elaborate all this and ensure that companies are going the right direction. Frankly, we can do this. Should we do this? Can we do this? Yes, but is it secure? So we talked about security and compliance. And last week we had a great session talking about the user interface, the customer interface, and just all of those items, just to make sure that look and feel is granted, because with great power comes great responsibility. Today, we're going to talk about eCRM. That means we're going to talk about the enterprise content management and records management. And with that, Dave, I don't know how you kick off, but I just want to say thanks to you for your continued wisdom on these items. And otherwise, we'll get started. Dave?
Well, thank you, Tim. And I do want to share, Tim has been involved, as I have, in many enterprise level activities around the implementation of Office 365 and the tenant admin. One of the most important parts, as we always see, is the creation of an eCRM as a product, using SharePoint and including all of our other products that we have within Office 365. And then looking for external, such as ECM, Documentum, FileNet. We have the opportunity to include those other products within our solution as we build it out, and using the platform of SharePoint, be it 2016 and soon to be 2019, especially in Office 365. We're pretty excited about the opportunity. So we're talking about collaboration, people and personalization. Social media is still content. Enterprise search is our most important aspect of what we want to talk about, especially because we have to be able to set classifications, we have to be able to set personalization, we have to target our audiences and make that content as findability as we possibly can. We need to include everything that we want to do and be able to have business intelligence driven from that as we move towards big data, and especially as we move towards artificial intelligence. We want to be able to access some of that, and how, what, where, when, and how do we make this happen for the individual. So let's talk a little bit about an overview of the governance that we need to look at. Again, this may be a repeat for those that have already participated in our webinars. I just want to briefly go over it so that we lay some groundwork for those policies and procedures and things that we need to cover a little bit going forward. So I'll briefly review a little bit about governance overview. And again, we put together a governance as a guideline on how SharePoint, in this instance as an eCRM platform, will be used within the organization. We'll make sure that we're looking at what the responsibilities, access level of the various members. Last week we talked about roles, responsibilities, who needs to be informed, and of course who needs to be consulted. We want to cover a wide breadth of the organization. So we're not only hitting the full enterprise, but we're also looking at the business units such as IT and technical. What are the processes in which we move documentation and we archive? What's data retention look like? How do we store that data, as well as how do we retain that data? So we have a strategic policy that may or may not already be engaged with each of the companies, but we want to take that and move it forward. And of course now, as more and more things come to light, we're on GDPR and the legal environment and HR environment. We want to make sure that we are covering our bases. So this document, as we would produce this through our questions and answers and our documentation, cover these areas. Our primary objectives, of course, is to always create the people infrastructure. We're not creating something for IT, although we consider them a very strong business unit. and a very important collaborator in how we're going to do this. We want to make sure that we focus on the business and the people and how they're going to use this. You know, as we talk more and more about change management, one of the biggest questions that we'll talk about is, what's in it for me? Why should I like my shared drive, I'm working with it fine, why should I switch over to an ECRM product as it in SharePoint, and especially going to the cloud? We'll talk a little bit about security. We'll talk a little bit about how do I make sure that the findability is improved and increased, and I can improve my productivity and my efficiency and my day-to-day outcome based on these governing policies. How can I measure what I'm doing? Here, the most important topic here is governance that excludes any of the areas that we've been talking about. It's an incomplete governance. And this is one of the most important areas because documents can be very sensitive and they can also be public. So we have to know and understand. We have to apply very smart intelligence on how we will work with these documents. And again, it's a combination of people, policies, and processes. Notice that I do say that it's people first. And we have to make sure that we understand how they're using it. Many times in the last webinars, we've talked about adoption. If we're not getting it to the right people at the right time and in a way that improves their user experience, adoption fails. And so we have to be very intelligent and smart in the way that we apply and use our ECM product. We have to make sure that we've identified KPIs that we can do that. We have to make sure that we've selected and crafted policies that are clearly understood by our stakeholders and our sponsors. So we have a clear understanding of what is it that we're doing, why are we doing it, and how is it improving our user experience and ultimately our customer experience going forward. Again, when we put this together, we work with our clients on the workshops that we put together over 6 weeks, and we come out with a guidebook, a playbook to put it together. It identifies the ownership of both businesses and technical teams responsible for what areas and what parts of the platform that they need. Is it information architecture? Is it data management? Is it a business unit like HR that has very high confidentiality needs? How do we set those policies? And we set this to make it an efficient and effective way. It's a living document, one that we use, and that involves both strategic and business-minded communities to improve these areas. At the same time, we know that we need to set the technical component team to manage it, support it, and handle the day-to-day operations of what will become a Tier 1 application across the organization. So again, SharePoint, Office 365, SharePoint Online will and is considered in most large organizations and even some smaller to medium-sized businesses as a Tier 1 app. It holds the content of the business and allows you to find and use that. So again, back to support, maintenance, keeping the lights on. We need to make sure a competent team is put in place. Among other things, our governance will include the documentation around equipment, documentation around storage, locations, maps of our facilities are considered confidential. And this information, as we place it in the ECRM product of SharePoint 2019, we need to make sure those things are there. How are we operating? We don't want that just given out to the public. We need to make sure that it is in a location that is encrypted at rest and move forward. Application use. What are the documentation around custom applications we build at? It's going to be stored in SharePoint in our ECRM product. Configuration, training, custom development as custom technical documentation is created. And then some of our support knowledge and base, again, falls back to our ECRM capabilities. For example, what is the process for a backup? What is the process for our business continuity of services, our DR? What and when is that going to happen? And can we keep it out in the cloud so that we know that it's secure and encrypted at rest? We want to make sure those things are put together. Very, very important. We want to make sure that we can operate with this. And How's it going to be used? What, when, and how is it reviewed? How and when is it updated? And when are times when we need to actually take a look at our strategic direction? Very, very important in looking at our ECRM product as well as governance. Again, the governance pyramid is real basic. It talks a little bit about as you move up the business process management and the confidentiality, we have higher visibility in governance. We want to apply higher governance. And the lower we go in content management, we want to make sure that we're identifying public documentation that's allowed to have the capability to share, collaborate, and engage with our customers, maybe through an extranet or through our intranet internally with our other partners. The governance model is always top-down. There are 6 basic committees that we look at. We start with the Executive Business Steering Committee that helps us move our adoption forward, but it also makes sure that we're following the company-wide rules and responsibilities. Our technical steering team tells us how we're going to keep the lights on and whether we're capable of doing something. We might move it all the way up to the OCIO board. The CIO has a board that allows us to make decisions and approve or reject particular policies that we want to put in place, or maybe new custom development will go to the OCIO board. And ultimately our executive sponsor at a C-level or about is going to tell us whether or not this really makes sense for the overall vision and the mission of what we're trying to do. And again, down a little bit lower, our local steering committees could be geolocation. We could be a global company, and we have different policies, procedures, guidelines that need to apply, much like they do with the European Union, or that we're dealing with the Asia Pacific folks and how they do that. Even with the United States, there are different states that have different ways of handling data, and there have been many court cases that apply only in specific areas. And of course, our project leadership team during the time that we need to move this. And I think, Tim, you spoke just a few minutes ago a little bit about a center of excellence, and that may or may not be a particular governance body, but they certainly support all of these teams through that center of excellence and those subject matter experts. Would you agree, Tim?
Yeah, absolutely. That center of excellence was just kind of a spin-off, or that one of those fringe benefits as we work through user interface and and the items that we went through in our last seminar. So be sure to see those. And Dave, I just want to reiterate, some of these things look busy, but they're not difficult. They're complex, but they're not difficult. And I'll remind everybody, if some of this seems redundant, the overview that Dave's giving, well, good, because so much of this from one of those first slides is dovetailed together. And I'll remind everybody that an incomplete governance is just as bad as no governance at all. It really all does fit together, Dave. So thanks for that overview, because adoption is everything, and bringing this on board and making sure that it's used is the whole key metric here. So with that, Dave, back to you, and I know you're going to dig into some of the more specifics as we talked about content record management.
Absolutely, Tim, and thank you. That really drives home the point that governance applies as governance applies, and without it, it's an incomplete governance. So let's talk a little bit about the ECRM planning. What are the questions that we need in order to make this happen? So we're going to really dig into some of the real nitty-gritty, finer points of ECRM lifecycle. What are the fundamental elements that we need? Fundamental elements that we need to be looking forward to. What kinds of documents another ECRM is going to be created? What are we creating? Are we creating maps, images, movies, Word documents, Excel spreadsheets of massive size? What is it that we're creating? Are there any templates that we can use for this documentation? What are the document properties going to look like as we ask for metadata to be attached? And we'll talk later about the automation of that process. Where are we going to store it? How's it going to be stored? Are we going to use standard SharePoint libraries to use for content that's relevant to the enterprise? What about project data? What about project templates? things that have a life cycle that come and go quickly. How are we going to manage that, and where are we going to go? How are we going to store it during its life cycle? Also, are we going to, we're going to be using the e-discovery capabilities for e-holds and lit holds. Where is that going to happen at? We need to talk and look about how that's going to go. How do we gain control or access to the documents? How is this going to happen for us to be able to findability and improve that findability going forward? I want to be able to have a search center that actually brings up relevant data to my search and applies it to and filtered the way that what I want it. That's a very big thing that we need to do. How do we move documents within the organization to members to contribute? Are we actually going to be able to have encryption? So we have a public key or a private key in our ability to contribute and collaborate when we're using Word Online or Excel Online or PowerPoint Online. We can actually collaborate in real time. So we can actually watch as someone is working on a document and we're working on it at the same time, and it's tracking. We're collaborating in real time. That's something that's unique, especially to the enterprise level of SharePoint 2019. One of the biggest questions that often comes up when we talk about what is document management and records management, what are the sizes that, everybody says, oh, that's just SharePoint, that's a toy. Well, I'm sorry, but it's not. It is something that is now at a full enterprise level and is above many of what we see FileNet and ECM going. Believe it or not, you can have up to 50 gig size files stored within SharePoint, and you can have well over 30 trillion entries within SharePoint now. That online engagement is phenomenal. So that's a very large number that we're able to go. One of the other things that we talk about in some of the true ECRM product is the fact that we are able to encrypt it at rest and make sure that we are accessing information with the right people at the right time in the right location. We know that review and approval process is something we'll talk a little bit more about. But the diagram here just talks about document management. When does a document become a record? We'll talk about that. How about archiving? What about imaging in SharePoint? Is SharePoint now capable of taking in images in real time? Yes, it is, but you have to have a bolt-on to be able to start that process of documentation. But there's a whole lot to talk about here as we go forward. We need to be able to talk about document management roles, ensuring that our plans incorporate the feedback from the organization. If we want to make sure that are we using a document template at the beginning of every document, before you can save it, you would need to set metadata. Is that appropriate? What are those metadata topics? What are the types of documents that need to have confidentiality metadata added to that? Do we need the documents to be able to be read in near real time as they're put up into a SharePoint library or document library? We want them to be able to be looked at, reviewed, and if there are things that are of question, then it would be quarantined. And we are capable of doing that today, but we need to make sure that people know that and that things are capable of doing it. One of the other big things we talked about last week is talking about the roles of the user of the documents. Who's going to review the documents? Who's going to be your author? Who is going to make sure it gets published? Who's going to be the monitor? Who's going to make sure things get edited, appropriate, and used in the language of the corporation or the company? Who's going to use these documents ultimately? Let me give you an example of one of the good things that we have here in this ECRM platform is that it's not hard-coded. Everything is through our common products, our standard products of Office 2016 with Word or Excel or PowerPoint or Publisher, Access for small databases. We don't have to go out and ask a programmer like they did at one large retail organization in order to change the word "the" that was duplicated within a document. It was $10,000. Here in this ECRM product, we're actually going to be able to pull that document up, pull it up in Word, change it, and put it back, at the same time keeping versions and archiving capability. We're also able to get a history log of when those changes are made and when those things are moved. Are you going to put a workflow in place for publication of these documents? Very, very important. If the document goes up to a portal, such as maybe an intranet for the corporation, you want to make sure that it's published and not just moved up and work that way. Who designs the user interfaces for these document search capability? Who's going to put together the interfaces for hosting documents? What's the library going to look like? How is it going to operate? And what are the policies and procedures for managing documents? I know in working with one of the large universities here in Minnesota that it was very, very important for the registrar to have the ability to set specific guidelines and set very specific policies for managing their type of documents. And she was very, very instrumental in helping to set those policies and guidelines that we needed to go. One of the other roles and responsibilities is who's going to own it. When the documents are put up into a Microsoft SharePoint library, are they owned locally, or is there an information management system owner who actually makes sure that we have documents in place, they're monitoring that, and when do they need to be moved from files or content to an actual record? A record is something that can be locked down so that it can't be edited, and that it needs then to be applied through some type of disposition or disposal of that document over time. Who's going to maintain the infrastructure of cloud locations? Are we going to rely upon our Center of Excellence? Are we going to rely upon a global admin who owns the tenant and make sure that there's content? There's lots of questions that need to be answered around roles and responsibilities. Any comments on that one, anyone?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. You know, a lot of times these tasks seem daunting, but I keep using the term, you know, it's complex, but it's not difficult. How can you even, instead of maybe assigning one person to this, how can you collaborate and spread the, you know, division of labor, if you will, Dave? What are some of the techniques that can be used to do that, to spread the division of labor on these governance policies relating to content?
I think one of the most important things is one of our fundamental project management processes that we use is a RACI. You know, a RACI will identify what are the roles, responsibilities, what are the tasks, what are the monitoring responsibilities, you know, who needs to be responsible, accountable, who needs to be informed, and who needs to be consulted. I think it falls back, Tim, to your fundamental project management process. And once you identify that and who's going to own it, you're spreading the wealth. And folks then know and sign off on, oh, that's my responsibility to make sure that Yammer conversations are monitored at the local level, being that departmental, divisional, or geolocation. But that RACI would be one technique that would be very powerful in making sure that happens. Does that answer the question, Tim?
Yeah, agreed. A RACI is going to be very very helpful. Responsibilities and all those outlined up front. I've found so many problems avoided, let's say, just by discussing how you're going to respond to that up front. Again, another reason for addressing governance and doing it early and doing it up front. Thanks, Dave. Can't wait to hear more.
Absolutely more. Thank you, Tim. Well, I think one of the things that we need to look at is what do our documents look like? What is the life cycle of a typical document? When we start to analyze how we use documents, what types of documents that we're going to use them for, we have to look at a content lifecycle strategy. And that strategy has to include what are the typical ownership areas? What are the taxonomies that need to be included? Establish a content program and production process. How are we going to disposition a file to a record, and then where's that going to go to? Is it going to go to the record center within SharePoint? Yes, it probably should. Are we using drop-off libraries? Are we using audience-targeted documentation that then needs to be worked through? So what's our strategy on how we're going to do that? We need to plan for what and how we're going to use metadata. Are we going to go out to a third-party vendor and ask them for our taxonomy and then build upon that. We also need to look at how is marketing going to use this, and are they going to enforce certain taxonomies or folksonomies to our content so that we are consistent and it improves our productivity through finding. The other part of the content lifecycle is the migration process. And we'll talk about that next week, a little bit about how do we, now that we've established what our policies, our procedures, guidelines, and practices will be, now let's move the data into the ECRM platform, and how do we apply that? So that's very important. How do we create asset production? How do we set, someone's going to want a certain number of archives or retention policy. What is a history log and how do I get to it and who should get to that to be able to go that? Are we complying with QA practices and compliances? Are we going back and revisiting our governance model as we go forward? Are we going to maintain roles and responsibilities? Here again, if we put that back on the local engagement for content, we're putting it back on the business. Okay, so now we need to talk about training. We need to talk about an understanding of these are now your responsibilities, and you're going to be accountable for making sure this data is maintained, it's secured, and it's available. And so now we're adding some new performance roles and responsibilities that can be part of a person who's already got everything going on in their business life and keeping the business alive now has some new responsibilities. We need to talk about that. How's that going to be part of their performance evaluation? We want to make sure that stakeholders are always engaged and that they have an understanding of what is it that we want to be able to do. We want to make sure that we're always looking at what are industry standards, what are industry comparisons, are we doing the right thing in the right place at the right time in order to stay competitive in a very fast-moving marketplace. As Tim indicated at the very beginning of our conversation, is that the world's changing fast and there will be losers and winners, and this is a big one, and how we maintain our content. So let's talk a little bit about. Go ahead,
Dave. I just want to interject here real quick. You mentioned some great things about taxonomy and folksonomy there. I want to remind our colleagues here and listeners and collaborators that we've partnered with firms that do just that and only that, or specialize on that, I should say. And again, it's just answering those questions even before you get into a situation, and it's deciding beforehand and upfront through governance what you're going to do to identify documents and what's going to be in there. And I literally think of, one of the old movies about the Washington Post and the Watergate issue, as I think it's called, All the President's Men. Jason Robards plays the Washington Post editor, and he's talking about when Woodward and Bernstein got that all the information on Watergate, and he said, as the overall editor of the paper, he said, "Run that baby." Okay, so that's why I asked the question before about how do we, use a division of labor. I don't see one person at a company just saying, "Hey, they're the editor, they're the final buck stops here." I just wanted to assure our colleagues that we've thought through this quite diligently, and even partnered with some of our specific partners that do just that or specialize in this, and so we can step you through that. Any other comments on that, Dave, before we move on?
No, I think you're spot on, Tim, and I think you need to be able to have that capability to collaborate and be able to have the setting of authority on how things are published. And if one of the great things using content lifecycle is understanding how workflows can apply to how content is stored and archived and moved across the environment so that the proper people have visibility, and then they have the authority to move something. And exactly what you said, Tim, move it quickly, not to be handcuffed by the tool itself. We want the ability to be able to say, go, let's get this done.
Or that one blocker. That's exactly right, Dave. Thanks.
Exactly. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how data is stored. And we have multiple areas of data within Office 365. You've got Yammer conversations, Skype for Business conversations. We now have team chat. We have the ability to store data within Outlook groups within groups itself. We have, a multitude of different places where content is stored, be it, and this is very important, be it structured data or unstructured data. So a conversation in Yammer could be very unstructured, even though it is threaded and it has the ability to search and find information within Yammer. It still is considered to be a semi or pseudo unstructured data because it's free flow. And data needs to be looked at. One of the beauties of content, even at that granularity level, is the ability to not even near real time, in real time monitor for keywords and metadata and folksonomy. All of the things that we need to be able to track and make sure that we are good corporate citizens is going on in the background of tools like Yammer or chat within Teams. We have the ability to quarantine if a conversation goes astray or it contains information as a credit card number or PII data or anything that we feel is considered to be confidential within the organization. We know that we can immediately quarantine that data. And now SharePoint even has the ability to use near real-time, not perfect real-time, scanning of documents to see what type of document it is. Are there confidentiality words being used? If a social security number is in a document inadvertently, it'll automatically identify it as a PII confidential. And we set those scopes through our Office 365 admin portal in what we call classification. We can classify data as based on manual input from a document properties when we even begin to create the document and when they want to store it within SharePoint in our ECM platform, or we can actually have it scan those documents and be automated in their ability to say, whoa, do I need to quarantine this, bring it to the attention of a manager or someone in information architecture so that they know that there is something here, or do I just automatically identify it then as a classified company private document and it's done automatically. So there's always opportunities to build on a world-class enterprise content records management system as Office 365, SharePoint 2016 and now 2019 have that ability to do it. We also have the ability to search across site collections, which is our way of organizing our locations of data. We have the ability to apply an enterprise search center so that we can look across multiple areas within the enterprise and find data. Now that in itself leads to a security issue that we want to talk about. When we classify document management, our planning should include the fact that do we want all documents available to all employees in their search center, or are we applying policies that indicate that this data is geolocation confidential or it is company confidential and should never ever be shown in a search relevance unless that person has specific authority to see that. And we can set that. And again, that's what makes SharePoint now a world-class ECRM product and platform to build upon. I think it's really, really important that we look at what are the functions, the features, and the potential benefits of using a platform like SharePoint today, much different than what we used in days prior to rolling it out at this level. Let's talk a little bit about how do we create this ECRM product? How do we put it together? Well, we know we have libraries. There can be libraries in multiple team sites. We have wikis. We have discussion center within SharePoint itself that contains structured and unstructured data. Our team sites allow for a collaboration. They allow for us to be able to put audience targeting on those documents if necessary. What if we want to roll up a document library that is stored on a team site and roll it up into a divisional site? We can do that with a portal. We have the ability to do a document center. It's a large scale library that allows us for enterprise knowledge base. We also have the ability for a drop-off library that would contain business rules. And a document center, the drop-off library would be so valuable in that the person who is working with documents and creating documents doesn't really need to know what library. So then maybe it's across multiple team sites. All they need to know is this is a document. It has this type of area that it needs to go to for engineering, and it contains information in this manner. The drop-off library automatically then has business rules that we set up that automatically then put it out in that library. It's one of the greatest ways to work with a world-class ECRM product like SharePoint 2016. Are we using this on a intranet site? It's possible. We can link that. Although Office 365 2016 to 2019 does not use public websites any longer. You'd have to create it and create that interface, but you can definitely do that. We have the ability with SharePoint and Office 365 to create hybrid. If we have confidential data that is private and very, very secured, we want to keep that on site. No problem. We set up a hybrid environment in SharePoint Online 2016. We make it available across. Maybe we sync data. Maybe we don't. We just know that we have the audit capability of knowing there are documents that are stored on-prem in a secured cage, and that we can see that there is a document there, but we may not be able to access that document. And that's a hybrid environment. Hybrid is very important and can be very valuable to a company. Let's talk a little bit about the ECRM types and the workflow that can be done within, and it started back in 2013. So this is nothing new to how documents are organized. We create it, we publish it, we promote it, we want to monitor it, and we want to start to look at the types of documents. We analyze what's going on. It could be all the way down into, what is it, structured or unstructured data? Is it involving employee information, involving customer information? Maybe we're drawing content from our CRM integration. We want to be able to know that documents, those templates, those master pages, and common documentation, that we follow some type of life cycle as we go forward, and so that we have the ability to comply with SOX compliance audits, and that if we do have an auditor come in, we can immediately say, yeah, our ECRM product has the ability to give you an audit trail. Let me show you, and it immediately puts it together. One of the biggest things that we talk about is, and again, this follows right along with our RACI, is that we need to understand the life cycle of a product. How's it going to have data added to it? Where is that going to happen? So we design a workflow for the document, and we move our way through this. And this is a common practice in setting up an ECRM product that we do, and this is how we would set it up, is so that we know along every swim lane, as well as every interactive capability, that we know exactly this is where we need to do. We did this for a large university system, for not only their library system for content, but also how would we move this across all of their finance as well. So, any questions on this particular document? There's a lot of information here, and this is what we do. Any questions, Tim?
No, none at all. It's just the takeaway here is there's a process to this, and this just reiterates our thoughts from earlier that this is complex, but it's not difficult. It's all laid out, and an incomplete governance is worse than none at all. So this is the idea, team. It's embrace this whole enchilada. Thanks, Dave.
And one of the
I'll just remind you, we've only got we're just under 10 minutes left. So
yeah.
I know we're nearing the end here, but.
Breeze, one of my favorite slides is coming up, Tim, so I want to make sure that we present that one. Then this being it. When we look at what ECRM platform looks like, this is so much bigger than what we have been talking about with each of the individual products, because we have life cycle across many, many areas. So when we start to put this information society governance around this, is how do we put it together? What's the glue that holds this all together? And what areas do we need to work on together in order to build a sound foundation, number one, and how do we build that together? So this is always a fun graphic that just really talks a little bit about how does it all work together and what does content really look like, and how are we building it together. Our policies on ECRM are very, very important because we need to not only reconsider, and I apologize, sometimes we have to drive it home a little bit with what are the policies. We have to be able to show auditing capability. We need to know document retention. I need to be able to follow a document that now becomes for how long, in what format, and how do I start to leverage my storage. Storage is expensive, and we want to make sure that. Can we add a barcode? Absolutely. That's one of the beauties of SharePoint is we can actually create a barcode for every document and have it pulled up just through smart code barcodes. It is a phenomenal tool. Again, knowing and understanding the functions, the features, and the potential benefits out of the box. This is a world-class ECRM product that needs to be looked at very carefully because it's in Office 365 and it is something that improves our capabilities going forward. The last thing that I really want to just cover a little bit is what are our service level agreements around document usage? How are we supporting and managing any customizations in our environments? We want to make sure that if there are custom rules, custom policies, when and where are they applied? How are we going to analyze if this is working for us? How are we going to go back and be able to look at that? And one of the greatest tools that's still available, there was a big concern that it would not be available to us, is SharePoint Designer 2016. It's out there. And again, it's a matter of setting the guidance and the policies around how it's used, but along with Design Manager now, and there are other tools that we are able to standardize how we look at this. We need to know if we're going to allow for that usage and where it goes. So with that, Tim, I think we've covered a lot of ground here today. There's a whole lot more to cover, and that's what we do in our governance workshops as we work with our clients to understand and drive forward the direction of an ECRM lifecycle. And again, we're going to talk a little bit about migration. Do you have any other questions, Tim?
No, but a comment, Dave. So much of this is on purpose. It's redundant because we're driving home these notions. And as I mentioned earlier, if this seems a little redundant, good, because governance is something that you need to stay ahead of. And I just want to even refer back to something that was said in the middle of the conversation. Dave, you mentioned lit hold, which stands for litigation hold. You not only have to plan for this, you literally have to prepare and practice for it. So litigation hold is something that can be externally placed upon you by the courts, and if for that reason alone you do governance, that's enough to get going. Much less just having these plans and what ifs in place to minimize risk. My takeaway here, my point is, so much of this is not even internal; it's external. GDPR, litigation hold that can pop up. You're in proceedings. You've really got to have your arms around it, and rather than panic, let's know and be prepared for that, because, Dave, it's just a matter of time, isn't it? It's not if it'll happen, it's when. And maybe you can close on those thoughts.
Absolutely, Tim. And I think it's really important that we have in place and have thought through, as you have said, what are the things that we need to think about? What are the questions that we need to ask ourselves first before we run into those instances where we're in the middle of a legal confrontation where we have to produce this information. If we have an ECRM product that gives us the almost immediate capabilities that this world-class product has, I think we would be further ahead. And the most important thing, again, is have we asked the right questions of ourselves, and have we put that down on paper so that we know and understand when things like this appear? So thank you, Tim. That was
So
outstanding.
Dave, yeah, it's often said that I'm saying this tongue in cheek because what I mentioned just previously is not meant to scare anybody. Quite the opposite. It's just to be prepared for it. In fact, we often interchange the word preparedness with planning in our discussions with our colleagues and clients. But the best part about not planning is that then failure comes as a total surprise and is not preceded by that that period of anxiety. We want to avoid that. We just want to be ready for that, for these contingencies, Dave. And again, it's not a scare tactic. It's just good practice. It just makes good horse sense.
It
So
does.
with that, Dave, I'll hand it back to you to conclude.
Yeah, well, thank you, Tim. I appreciate everybody's attendance today and the fact that we were able to open those discussion points and talk to you a little bit about ECRM. Next week, we're going to talk about now populating an ECRM through an ETL, extract, transform, and load migration process. And we'll talk really specifically about what are the pre-planning all the way through how do we support and maintain a migration plan to put that together and how we make it work. So thank you with that. We'll call her good for the day, and thank you everyone for attending.